their stories so they can change the world. Outside of his day job, he's friends with Peter and Virginia Sargent from the film and does his own exploring of the West with his family, albeit not in the Sprinter van. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks for having me.
Even better the second time. Well done.
I didn't know when to jump in. I was worried.
Welcome, Rob. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us. You know, this film does something pretty special. It looks past misconceptions and stereotypes when it comes to rural voices around climate change. So I'm hoping that you can articulate what the original goal for this film was, and then what the goal is now as it continues to be shown and screened across the country now and then.
Gladly, yeah. And thanks again for having me. Thanks again for those who have showed up online and in person. I'm sure Peter and Virginia would be thrilled to know how many more folks have seen the film. As it says in the movie, Peter and Virginia started their journey towards all of this as sort of organizers. They went and worked on behalf of a number of different nonprofits, getting folks to sort of recognize their voice and exercise it on behalf of the climate, on behalf of the environment. And I think they realized with this that there were some voices missing in that, that people weren't being represented in speaking up and what it meant. And I think they asked me to speak. I think one of the reasons they asked me to be on the board, as I really believe and do this professionally, that narratives and stories are the way we connect with each other. There's a quote I believe in that opposable thumbs are what make us human. Stories are what tell us what to grab onto. So it's this idea that stories and narrative give us context and point us all in the same direction. I think there's a lot, religions are story based for a reason, that it gives people the context, it gives people a sense of belonging. And so much more than blasting out stats, much more than blasting out numbers, much more than blasting out even beliefs, creating a common narrative is really important. And that's what they were looking to do is there's this sort of, I think on at least one side of political debate in this country, a narrative of where we're headed and the role that climate plays. And as organizers, I think they saw that everybody's got to find their own part of that story. Or part of that narrative. What's their story that connects to that narrative? And so, by and large, folks in the West aren't represented, and especially folks who live and work near on the land in the West aren't represented. A change in climate impacts them, but the movement to try and change that, they're not represented. And so, when you're trying for mass mobilization, you need everybody to see themselves in that movement, and you need to see themselves in the narrative. And so what's their story? How does their story connect to the overall narrative? And Wild Climate was a way, one way for them to allow more people to see themselves in this climate narrative, to see themselves as part of the change, to see themselves as being hampered, being impacted by climate change, and what it would mean to fix it. And so that's what it started as, and I think they're actually in a unique spot where it continues in that way, and they've sort of handed it off. It's now in the hands of this conference and other conferences, and making its way around with the hopes that it continues to do just that people will see this and realize that their own unique story has a place in that narrative, that if they can get beyond politics, if they can get beyond what they might read on some internet whole, that there's a place for them as part of this narrative, and that no matter what their story is, they can attach it to this bigger overall place that we're headed.
Thank you. I have another question for you, and then we'll go to the audience. So our theme for this conference is grief and hope in a changing climate. And clearly the folks that Peter and Virginia met with all across the American West are universally facing challenges in their local communities related to climate change. And there's some anxiety around that, and that anxiety is quite understandable. What emerges for you in this film and in your work with Wild Climate with respect to hope? What is it about these stories that can energize us and bring us together?
Yeah, I think it's that it's when you start telling the story of what climate change looks like in everybody's life, you realize that it's much more common than popular journalism might lead you to believe. That when you can get down to it, there's a lot of common perceptions, and people will agree if you allow them the space to find their own part of the narrative, and if they can find themselves in it, they're willing to be there. They I had chatted with Peter in preparation for this, and he shared a couple anecdotes, and one was from Alvin Smith, who runs the Arrowhead Dairy Farms. He, it's a thousands upon thousands of head operation. I think it's in New Mexico, and was really skeptical. They approached him, they'd found him, and he was just super skeptical. And at the very same time, in the same exact conversation, broke down, and cried for quite a while. They said it was a really intense conversation, talking about a winter storm that had passed through and killed 500 head of his cattle, and that he, despite being such a large operation, really cared for each animal, and is really a kind of thoughtful farmer, thoughtful dairy farmer. And so losing 500 head of cattle, I mean, he cared about each and every one. And so while he might be skeptical about climate change, I think he can relate to losing loved ones. He can relate to losing something that he cares about. And so there's that grief part, but I think the hope is that comes in when you realize that, like, okay, if that's what Albin's connection is, there's somebody else that's lost something. You can connect him with the Purple Sage folks, right? And say, well, you've lost something. You lost something because of a storm that was either created or made worse by climate change. Let's talk. And it's in those connections, and it's in people coming together and realizing they have common cause that you grow a movement. And so I think it's that, that if you do the work that Peter and Virginia did, and if you continue to do the work of showing this film or doing other things that might allow people to find their part of the narrative, that you're going to make those connections, and that you'll find that common ground, and in that common ground be able to affect sort of the large scale change that they want to see.
Thank you so much. Narrative and common ground have been the through line for many of the conversations we've been having this weekend. With that, I'm going to open it up to questions in the room. If you are on Zoom and have a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll see if we can get to you. Are there any questions for Rob? And don't be shy. This always takes a moment. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about approaches to affect federal policy, and great stories, narratives, we're with it. How do we get them to actually make something happen with the federal agencies, and with the way that Congress makes decisions or has their orientations toward this issue?
So let me repeat that for the benefit of everybody. So Rob, can you speak to the disconnect between the locals and then the federal folks that represent them? How does narrative making actually translate to change at that level?
Yep, it's long. It's an investment. There is no silver bullet, and Peter, as we were prepping for this, would say the same about Wild Climate. It's not a silver bullet itself. It's the hard work of finding everybody's connection to it. And I think when you find that common ground, and when you're doing the work, you're building influence. If an elected official comes back and there's enough folks who have that common ground, that elected official is going to listen. I think as it relates to federal policy, I think if Western senators were to come together, regardless of party, they would have as much power right now as Joe Manchin has over the budget. The way that our government's run, senators from the West who don't represent a ton of people but have an equal amount of vote as a senator from New York or California have an outsized role in our federal government. And if they were to band together and want to fix and want to address climate change, they could. That vote would sort of be unstoppable. And so how do we involve them, right? And so what's the, how many people need to get together to impact them? What other entities, so it's ranchers and agriculture are big voices that they listen to, which is why Peter in Virginia did this. I think increasingly, I think Western states are a great example. Outdoor recreation is a huge voice in the West. I know Colorado has an, Office of Outdoor Recreation has invested a lot of money in bringing in the outdoor rec industry here. They need to be involved. So who are these different actors that when folks that are most impacted, when folks that want to see change start coming together, who can they bring in? Who are they engaging with that in a certain industry? Are they starting to get their towns and their municipalities bought in on this idea? And it's kind of, as soon as you have enough folks to change minds, to change a vote, you do that and you build that way. And it kind of all stems from that idea of narrative and people working towards a common goal, and then bringing in where you can, and when you have enough influence to do so, getting them to actually impact that policy. And so I think the West is, if you're talking about climate, is a great place to start, because you have so many senators and elected officials who sort of have this outsized role, and who, I think here in the West, we see it, the impacts of climate change as much as anywhere, if not more than anywhere else in the country. And so I think that the urgency of our story as it relates to climate change is as pressing, if not more, than anywhere else in the country.
Excellent point. Thank you. We have time for one more question. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Sally.
Hey, Peter in Virginia interviewed gave stories for 4 people who were willing to tell their stories. And I'm just curious, did they talk to other people who felt the same way, but weren't willing to give the stories, weren't willing to tell the stories? And if so, how many people, how many of us are out there, that aren't willing to share?
Thank you. Great question. So Rob, the question is, while we heard from a handful of folks in this film who were quite willing to talk to Peter in Virginia, what about all the folks they encountered on the road who were unwilling to have their voice in the mix here?
Yeah, there were a lot. There was, I think one story that stuck out to me, and I remember this just from when they were on the road and had come back one point, was a guy, he ran sort of the emergency services department in Rio Doso, New Mexico. So he was in charge of wildfire mitigation. And he was trusted by the local community, right? He had the codes to ranchers' gates, so he could trespass, he could kind of go through anybody's land in service of wildfire mitigation. And I think ranching communities, those aren't doled out freely or willingly in many cases. And he very openly said he didn't know the science. He's not interested particularly in the science of climate change, doesn't get ozone and what it means, but he does know that wildfires are getting worse. Like, full stop, his connection was that wildfires are getting worse. And Joe, this guy's name is Joe Kenmore, he's going to conferences all the time, several conferences a year. He's meeting up with folks. He's studying wildfire science as it relates to mitigation. And so he's going to all these places. And so they weren't able to get him on this film, but I think what Peter and I were talking about as we prepped is maybe his connection to the narrative isn't being in this film, but it is talking about climate change at those conferences he's at, which are much more conservative, much more rural. If he's not willing to be on a film by a couple of East Coast, environmental activists, that's fine. I think, what is his connection? How can we get him into it? And Peter had said, can we push him to talk about climate change and how they might mitigate it at the conferences he goes to, in the circles he runs in. And so there were a lot. They put out thousands of emails and phone calls. They connected with hundreds of people to get down to the 4. And I think they probably filmed a dozen or so that then got narrowed to the 4 you saw in the film. And that is the metaphor for the organizing it's going to take itself. We need to talk to everybody to see what their connection is. There's going to be a certain amount of people that will never be with us. Of the people that are, what's their connection, or what's their story as it relates to how climate change is impact, and what's the action they can take to make it better. I think the metaphor there of how they built this form is the metaphor of how this is going to have to happen. It's not, there is no silver bullet. There is no, if we just pass the right policy, if we just use the right words, like, story isn't messaging, right? That's not what narrative and story is. Narrative is the sense of feelings you want to give people to have, and the connection they feel to it. And to do that, you've got to put in the work. A community narrative, a collective narrative, takes time and it takes work. And so I think they would say, Peter and Virginia, that how they did this film is how we're going to have to do this writ large in community after community after community.
Outstanding. Let's thank Rob for his contributions today. Rob, thank you. We're really privileged to have your perspective, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, I think there's the Wild Climate contact information. Don't hesitate to get in touch. Either myself or Peter and Virginia would love to answer any follow-up questions. If you're interested in getting involved or figuring out how this all works, and have more, please do be in touch.
Great. We will encourage that. Thank you.